The morning Alice Hawthorne walked into the Harlan County courthouse with nothing but a deed pressed flat against her chest, and the dust of 3 hard weeks still on her boots. Not a single man in that building believed she would walk back out with anything more than she had carried in. It was the autumn of 1882, and the territory of Wyoming was still young enough to be cruel in the way that only places without proper roots could manage places where law was written on paper, but enforced by whoever had the most land and the loudest voice. Alice was 31 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned back under a sun-bleached bonnet, and eyes the color of creek water after a long rain, a kind of gray-green that sharpened whenever she was angry, and she was very angry that morning. She had been angry since the day they lowered her husband Thomas into the ground, and the men who owed him money stopped coming around, and the man who had always wanted his land started sending letters that called themselves legal notices. Thomas Hawthorne had died of a fever in late July, 6 weeks after staking their homestead claim on 160 acres along the Sweetwater tributary good land, well watered, with a southern slope that caught the light just right for crops and enough flat ground near the creek for cattle. He had filed the claim in good faith under the Homestead Act, paid his fees, kept his improvements record in a leather-bound ledger that Alice now carried along with the deed. He had been 29 years old and strong as a post oak before the fever took him, and he had believed with the whole of his heart that the land was theirs. But Thomas was dead, and Walter Greer was not. Walter Greer owned the Rocking G Ranch, which sprawled across 11,000 acres to the north and west of the Hawthorne claim, and he had wanted those 160 acres along the Sweetwater for going on 4 years, since before Thomas and Alice had even arrived from Missouri. He had made Thomas an offer once, a low and insulting one, and Thomas had declined it politely. Since Thomas's death, Walter Greer had not been polite at all. The letter that Alice had received 3 weeks ago had been signed by a man named Cornelius Fitch, who styled himself an attorney at law out of Casper, and it had stated, in language that circled around its meaning the way a buzzard circles a carcass, that her claim to the property was legally uncertain on account of certain procedural irregularities in the original filing, and that it would be in her best interest to consider a settlement offer from his client rather than face what would surely be a costly and ultimately unsuccessful legal challenge. It had not said Walter Greer's name anywhere in it, but Alice had known. Everyone in Harlan County knew. She had ridden the 40 miles to the county seat alone on her roan mare, sleeping one night under a cedar brake with her rifle across her knees, and spending the second night in a boarding house in Millbrook, where the woman at the desk had looked at her dusty dress and her lack of a male companion with the kind of barely concealed pity that Alice despised more than outright hostility. She had arrived at the courthouse first thing in the morning, when the dew was still on the hitchrails, and she had asked to see the land records clerk, and then the deputy registrar, and then the assistant to the county judge, climbing each rung of that bureaucratic ladder with the patience of a woman who had already spent everything else she had. The assistant to the county judge, a thin man named Aldous Price with ink-stained fingers and an air of practiced condescension, had listened to her explain her situation for approximately 4 minutes before folding his hands on his desk and saying what the letter had only implied. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, in the tone of a man explaining arithmetic to a child, "the filing was made in your husband's name. Your husband is deceased. The improvements requirement under the Act requires continuous habitation and cultivation for 5 years, and your husband completed only 6 weeks of that period. Furthermore, without a male heir or a male relative to continue the claim in your stead, and given certain questions that have been raised regarding the survey boundaries by a neighboring landholder of considerable standing in this county, I'm afraid your claim would not hold in court. I say this not to be unkind, but to save you the considerable expense of finding that out the hard way." Alice had looked at him for a long moment. She had the deed in her hand. She had Thomas's ledger. She had receipts for the filing fees and a letter from the land office in Cheyenne confirming the claim number. "Mr. Price," she said quietly, "my husband filed this claim legally and in good faith. I have lived on that land since we arrived. I have planted a kitchen garden. I have kept the house. I have done every piece of improvement that the law requires, same as any man would. My name may not be first on that filing, but the law does not say a widow cannot continue a claim." "The law," Aldous Price said, picking up his pen to signal that the conversation was ending, "is something that will ultimately be determined by a judge. And judges in this territory are busy men with full dockets. My professional assessment, shared as a courtesy, is that a challenge of this nature would not succeed." She had walked out into the courthouse corridor and stood there for a moment with her jaw tight and her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of not saying the several things she had wanted to say. The corridor was wide and wood-floored and smelled of tobacco and old paper, and the sound of boots came from further down where the main entrance opened onto the street. She was trying to decide whether to go back to the boarding house and write a letter to the land office in Cheyenne, or to find a proper lawyer, or to simply ride home and figure out what to do from there, when she very nearly collided with a man coming around the corner from the direction of the records room. He caught her by the elbow before she stumbled, steadied her with a grip that was firm without being rough, and then stepped back immediately and touched the brim of his hat. "Beg your pardon, ma'am," he said. Alice looked up at him. He was tall, with broad shoulders and the kind of weathered, sun-darkened face that came from years of outdoor work rather than anything fashionable. He was perhaps in his mid-30s, with dark hair that had gone slightly too long and needed cutting, and eyes that were a very clear, direct shade of brown that made him look like he was paying attention even when he was standing still. He wore a rancher's clothes, good quality but well used, a brown canvas coat over a collarless shirt, boots that had seen serious work. He had a sheaf of papers under his arm and an expression that suggested he had just come from something that had not gone well either. "No harm done," Alice said and started to move past him. "You were just in with Price," he said. "It was not a question." She stopped. "I was. So was I about an hour ago on different business." He glanced at the deed she was holding, then back at her face. "He gave you the same speech he gives everyone he wants to discourage, I'd guess. The law is complicated, judges are busy, why don't you consider settling?" Alice straightened. "And what would you know about that?" "Enough," he said. He shifted the papers under his arm and put out his right hand. "Dexter Abbott. I run the Double Bar A, about 12 miles southwest of Millbrook." She looked at his hand for a moment, then shook it. "Alice Hawthorne. I have a homestead claim on the Sweetwater tributary." Something shifted in his expression, a recognition, though not the kind that made her wary. "Hawthorne," he said. "Thomas Hawthorne's place." "My place," she said with a precision that was deliberate. "Thomas was my husband. He passed in July." "I'm sorry," Dexter Abbott said, and he said it in the way that people say things when they actually mean them, without the social performance that usually accompanied condolences from strangers. "I knew Thomas to nod to. Good man. He came by once to ask about where the water ran in spring. We had a neighborly conversation about the creek levels." "He spoke of you," Alice said, and that was true. Thomas had mentioned the rancher from the Double Bar A who had been decent to him when some of the other established landowners had been less welcoming. She had not put together the name until now. "Walter Greer is making a move on your claim," Dexter said. It was still not a question. He said it the way a man states a fact he already knows and finds unpleasant. "He is," Alice said, "through his lawyer. And apparently through the county records office, based on what Mr. Price just spent 4 minutes telling me." Dexter's jaw set in a way that she would later learn meant he was deciding something. "Price is Greer's man," he said. "Has been for years. He's not a judge and he's got no legal authority over your claim. He's just the first obstacle Greer puts in the road." "I know that," Alice said. "The question is what to do about it. Do you have documentation, original deed, filing receipts, the claim number?" I have all of it." She held up the leather ledger. "Thomas kept meticulous records. I kept meticulous records after him." Dexter Abbott looked at her for a moment with those direct brown eyes, and she felt the curious sensation of being assessed not with skepticism, but with the kind of honest attention that was rarer than it should have been. "There's a lawyer in Casper," he said. "Not Cornelius Fitch. A man named Robert Ellison. He's handled land disputes in this territory before, and he's won more than he's lost, which is about all you can say for anyone in that line of work. I can ride with you if you like, or at least write you a letter of introduction, if you'd rather make the trip yourself." Alice studied him. He was a rancher, which meant he was a man of property and standing in this county, which meant his lending his name to her situation carried weight. She was not a woman who shrank from accepting help when it was genuinely offered, but she had learned over the last several weeks to be careful about the difference between help and control, between a hand extended in solidarity and one extended in the expectation of gratitude that would need repaying on someone else's terms. "Why would you do that?" she asked directly. "You don't know me." He did not seem offended by the directness. "Because Walter Greer has been buying up claims along the Sweetwater Valley for 3 years, and every time he does it, he gets a little bigger and a little louder, and eventually he's going to set his sights on land that borders mine. And because it's not right," he added, and there was something in his voice that made her believe he meant that second reason more than the first. "A woman shouldn't lose her land because her husband died and the men in power have decided the law doesn't apply to her the way it applies to them." Alice was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the courthouse's tall windows, she could see the main street of the county seat going about its business, a freight wagon rumbling past, a group of men talking on the boardwalk, a child chasing a dog past the general store, the world continuing to function while her life sat on the edge of a knife. "All right, Mr. Abbott," she said. "I'll accept the introduction, and I will not turn down the company on the road if you're offering it sincerely." "I am," he said. They rode to Casper together the following morning, having spent the previous evening in separate accommodation at the same boarding house, and during the 2-day ride Dexter Abbott proved to be exactly what he had appeared to be: steady, knowledgeable, and honest in a way that made the time pass without effort. He told her what he knew about the territorial land laws and the Homestead Act's provisions for widows, which were limited but real. He told her about Robert Ellison, who had a reputation for taking cases that other lawyers considered lost causes and finding the angles that made them winnable. He asked her questions about the claim, about the improvements, about the timeline, and he listened to her answers with the kind of focused attention that made her feel as though her words were being taken seriously. She, in turn, told him about Missouri, about meeting Thomas at a church social in 1878, about the decision to come west that had felt at the time like the beginning of something enormous, and had turned out to be exactly that, though not always in the ways they had planned. She told him about the 6 weeks on the Sweetwater before Thomas got sick, about the way the fever had moved through him faster than either of them had thought possible, about the morning she had woken up and known before she checked that he was gone. She told these things without excessive emotion, not because she was not grieving, but because grief, at that point, had become simply the medium in which she moved, the air she breathed, and she had found that the only way forward was to keep moving rather than to stand still and examine it. Dexter listened. He did not offer hollow comfort or tell her that time healed all wounds. He said once that it sounded like Thomas had been a good man and that she had been a good wife to him, and that both of those things deserved to be honored by fighting to keep what they had built. She had appreciated that more than she could easily have said. Robert Ellison's office was on the 2nd floor of a building on the main street in Casper, up a flight of stairs that creaked on every step, in a room that was floor to ceiling with papers and law books, and smelled pleasantly of pipe tobacco and old leather. Ellison himself was a compact man in his late 50s with a trim gray beard and the kind of economy of movement that suggested He had learned long ago not to waste energy on anything that did not matter. He read through Alice's documents with the careful thoroughness of a man who was actually going to use them, asked several sharp and specific questions, and then sat back in his chair and looked at her over his reading glasses. "Your claim is defensible," he said. "It's not without complications, and I won't pretend otherwise. But the Act does provide for widows to continue a deceased husband's claim, and your documentation is better than 90% of what I see in cases like this. The issue is going to be the survey dispute, which is what Greer is planning to use as his primary challenge. He's going to claim that the original survey boundaries are irregular and that a portion of your claim overlaps with land he holds title to under a prior grant." "Does it?" Alice asked. "Almost certainly not," Ellison said. "But proving it requires a resurvey, which costs money and takes time, and Greer knows that most widows in your position don't have either. He's counting on you to take his settlement offer before it gets to that point." "What is the settlement offer?" Dexter asked from his chair against the wall, where he had been quiet while Alice and Ellison talked. "It'll be something insulting," Ellison said. "Enough to look like generosity to the outside observer. Maybe $200, maybe $250, for land that's worth 8 or 10 times that with the water access." "I'm not taking a settlement," Alice said. "Tell me what I need to do." Ellison looked at her with the measured respect of a man who had seen a lot of people sit in that chair, and not many of them hold his gaze that steadily. "What you need," he said, "is money for the resurvey. I can recommend a man, a government surveyor named Patterson out of Cheyenne, who is scrupulously honest, and whose findings will be difficult to contest in court. You need patience because this will take months, not weeks, and you need someone who can testify to the improvements in habitation, ideally someone with standing in the county." He glanced at Dexter as he said the last thing. Dexter met his look steadily. "I'll testify," Dexter said, without hesitation. Alice turned to look at him. He was already looking at her, not at Ellison, and there was something in his expression that went slightly beyond the practical solidarity he had been offering since they met, something that he seemed to realize himself because he looked away, back at Ellison. "I can also speak to the issue of the survey boundaries," Dexter said. "I know that land. I've ridden it. The Hawthorne claim sits well clear of anything Greer holds a legitimate title to." "Your testimony would carry weight," Ellison confirmed. "A rancher of your standing testifying on behalf of the claim would complicate Greer's position considerably." He folded his hands. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I'll take this case. My fee will be $50 retainer and a further $200 if we win, nothing additional if we lose. I want to be clear that it will take time and there is no guarantee, but I think we have a strong position." Alice put her hand into the pocket of her skirt where she kept her money, which was everything she had left from the sale of Thomas's pocket watch and the last of their savings. She counted out $50 and laid it on Ellison's desk. "Then let's begin," she said. The ride back from Casper to Millbrook took 2 days, and they camped the first night beside a shallow branch of the Platte River where cottonwoods grew thick along the bank, and the evening came in purple and gold over the hills to the west. Dexter built a small fire and Alice made coffee from the supplies in her saddlebag, and they sat across the fire from each other in the comfortable silence of two people who have already talked enough to know they are not going to run out of things to say, which is a different kind of quiet than the silence between strangers. "You didn't have to offer to testify," Alice said, when the coffee was poured. "That'll put you at odds with Greer, and he's a powerful man in this county." "I know what Walter Greer is," Dexter said. He was looking at the fire, but she could see the side of his face in the firelight, the set of his jaw, the faint furrow between his brows. "I've watched him operate for 5 years. He picks on people who can't fight back. He uses lawyers and paperwork instead of guns mostly, but it comes to the same thing, taking what belongs to other people because he can." "And you've never stood up to him before?" She asked it plainly, without accusation. He looked at her then. "I have. There was a family named Calderon, Mexican couple, had a claim about 8 miles east of yours 4 years ago. I testified in their survey dispute, same kind of thing. They lost anyway on a technicality that still makes my blood hot to think about. He paused. But this time is different. Why? He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his face that was entirely honest and slightly vulnerable in a way that seemed unfamiliar to him, as though honesty on this particular subject required a different kind of effort than the honesty he deployed on practical matters. Because you're not leaving, he said. The Calderons were tired. They'd been fighting for 2 years and they had children and they needed to be somewhere safe. But you walked into that courthouse with $50 in your pocket and a dead husband's deed, and you told Aldous Price where he could put his professional assessment. A smile crossed his face, brief and genuine. I haven't seen that in a long time. I didn't want to let it walk out the door alone. Alice looked at him across the fire for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. There was something beginning to shift inside her, something she was not ready to name, and she was also still grieving Thomas, and she was also in the middle of the most serious fight of her life, and she was also aware of the fact that she was sitting beside a river in the dark with a man she had known for 4 days. She filed everything carefully and let the silence sit between them, comfortable and warm like the fire itself. "Well, Mr. Abbott," she said, "I appreciate the company, on the road and otherwise." "Dexter," he said, "if you're willing." "Dexter," she said, "and I'm Alice." They arrived back in Millbrook the following afternoon, and Alice rode the remaining 12 miles to her homestead alone as she had intended, and when she came up to the low rise that gave the first view of the house and the creek and the slope of land to the south, she stopped her horse and sat there for a moment looking at it. It was not much to look at. She knew that a one-room soddy with a wooden frame extension Thomas had started in June and not finished, a small barn, a kitchen garden that needed tending, a corral where her 2 remaining horses stood with their heads over the rail looking at her. But it was hers, and it was Thomas's dream-made material, and she was not going to let Walter Greer take it. She dismounted, unsaddled the roan, fed the horses, started a fire in the stove, and sat down at Thomas's desk to write a letter to the government surveyor in Cheyenne. The weeks that followed were among the most difficult Alice had ever lived through, and she had lived through some difficult ones. Waiting was its own kind of hard, harder in some ways than action, because it gave her too much time with her own thoughts in a house that had been built for 2 people and was now occupied by 1. She worked the homestead from first light to last, clearing the extension Thomas had started, hauling wood, tending her garden, mending fences, doing the 1,000 small tasks that kept a piece of land from going to ruin under a person's hands. The work kept her sane mostly. Cornelius Fitch sent another letter in October, more explicit this time, stating that his client was prepared to offer $250 for the claim and that this offer would be withdrawn if she proceeded with legal action. Alice wrote back to Mr. Fitch, through Robert Ellison's office, to say that the offer was declined. Dexter came by on a Thursday in the middle of October, riding across the creek in the mid-morning with a side of cured pork wrapped in cloth and a copy of the territorial newspaper, which she had not had access to since leaving Missouri. He did not make a production of the visit or present it as anything other than what it was, a neighbor checking on a neighbor, and she appreciated the lack of ceremony. They sat at her kitchen table and drank coffee and talked for 2 hours about the progress of the case, about the surveyor's expected arrival date, about a family he knew in the valley who had managed a similar situation through the land office in Cheyenne, about the coming winter and what it would mean for the homestead. He came back 2 weeks later, and then again 2 weeks after that, and the visits settled into a rhythm that neither of them commented on, because commenting on it would have required naming something they were both apparently content to let exist in the space where things exist before they are spoken. She noticed things about him. The way he took his hat off when he came inside, always, even though she had not asked him to. The way he talked about his ranch hands, a man named Old Pete who had been with him for 12 years, and a young Mexican fellow named Ernesto who was learning to break horses with the easy affection of someone who considered the people who worked for him to be genuinely worth caring about. The way he listened, which was not the polite waiting of someone composing his next sentence, but the actual attending to what was being said. The way he laughed, which was rare enough to be worth noticing and genuine enough to change the whole character of his face when it happened. She noticed, too, that he never pushed, never suggested that she needed help with anything she had not asked for help with, never implied by word or glance that her situation warranted anything other than respect. He treated her as though she were exactly as competent as she was, which in her experience was not how most men treated women, and she found it both disarming and rather wonderful. The government surveyor, Patterson, arrived in late October with 2 assistants and a mule loaded with equipment, and spent 3 days walking and measuring every inch of the Hawthorne claim, including the boundary areas that Greer's people had been contesting. He was a careful man who spoke little and recorded everything in a notebook that he kept in his breast pocket. Alice accompanied him on the survey, answering his questions and pointing out the markers Thomas had set. On the 3rd afternoon, Patterson showed her his preliminary findings on the map he had drawn. "Your claim is well within its recorded boundaries," he said, tracing the lines with his finger. "The nearest point to any Rockingham land is here, along the northwest corner, and there's a clear buffer of nearly a quarter mile. Whatever dispute is being raised about survey irregularities, it does not appear to be supported by the current condition of the land." Alice looked at the map for a long time. "Will your report hold in court?" "It is a United States government survey conducted under federal standards," Patterson said, with the mild pride of a man who does his work properly. "I would expect it to hold anywhere." She wrote to Ellison that evening and included Patterson's preliminary notes. Ellison wrote back within 2 weeks to say that he had filed the survey with the court, and that Walter Greer's attorney had responded by requesting a delay in proceedings, which was exactly what a lawyer did when he realized his position was weaker than he had believed. Dexter came by on a Saturday in early November with his ranch hand Ernesto to help her finish the wooden extension on the soddy, which she had been trying to complete alone between everything else and making slow progress on. She had not asked him to come, he had offered, the previous visit, and she had said that would be welcome if he could spare the time. He had said he would make the time. Watching Dexter Abbott work was, she found, something that required deliberate attention to not watch too obviously. He worked with the kind of methodical efficiency that came from years of doing physical labor without complaint, measuring twice before cutting, checking his work at every stage, moving with a quiet confidence that was neither showing off nor self-conscious. He and Ernesto had the exterior framing of the extension complete by noon, and the roof boards roughed in by late afternoon, which was 3 times what Alice had managed alone in the same amount of time with better materials. She made dinner for all 3 of them, a proper beef stew with the last of the potatoes from her garden and cornbread from the cast-iron pan, and they ate at the table that was now, with the extension, just barely not too small for the room. Ernesto was 20 years old, thoughtful and quiet with careful dark eyes that seemed to notice a great deal, and he spoke to Alice with a natural respect that was clearly not a performance but simply how he talked to people. He ate 2 full bowls of the stew and said it was the best he had had since his grandmother's kitchen in New Mexico, and she believed him. After Ernesto had gone out to check on the horses and give them some time to themselves, which he did with the tactful invisibility of someone who had noticed something without being told, Alice and Dexter sat at the table with the remains of the coffee and the early winter dark pressing at the windows, and the silence between them was, for the first time, slightly charged with something beyond ease. "I want to tell you something," Dexter said. "All right," Alice said. He was looking at his coffee cup, turning it slightly on the table. "I've been coming out here," he said, "partly because of the case, because I think what Greer is doing is wrong and I want to help stop it. That part is real." He looked up. "But I've also been coming because I like being here. I like talking to you. He stopped, and the pause was one of the more honest pauses she had seen in a long time. "I don't want to say something that's wrong to say when you're still grieving, and I don't know exactly what is right to say. But I wanted you to know that my being here is not purely, that there is something more than neighborly duty involved on my part, and I thought you should know that." Alice looked at him for a moment. The fire in the stove was low and the room was warm, and the sound of Ernesto moving around outside with the horses was faintly audible, a small domestic reassurance of the world going about its business. "Thomas has been gone 5 months," she said, "and I loved him, and I still love him in the way that you love someone who was a part of your life. That doesn't go away." She folded her hands on the table. "But I also know that life doesn't stop, and I know what I feel and what I don't feel, and I can tell the difference." She met his eyes. "I appreciate your saying it plainly. That took some doing, I expect." "More than some," he said, and the ghost of that rare smile was on his face. "Then I will say plainly in return that I have also been glad of the visits for reasons beyond the case," she said, "and that I am not in any hurry, but I'm not running away from it either." He nodded slowly, and something in him seemed to settle like a knot releasing. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." They sat together a little longer, and then Ernesto came back in from the cold with rosy cheeks and a cheerful report on the condition of the horses, and the conversation moved back to easier ground. And when they left, an hour later, Dexter turned in the saddle as he rode away and touched his hat brim, and she stood in the doorway of the newly extended house and watched him go and felt, for the first time since July, something that was not grief but was not nothing either. November deepened into December, and the case proceeded with the grinding slowness of territorial law, which moved when it chose to and not when anyone pressed it. Ellison sent word that the hearing date had been set for the second week of February. Greer's attorney, Fitch, had filed a countermotion challenging the validity of the government survey, which Ellison described as a desperate move by a man who could see his position collapsing. The county judge, a man named Hargreaves, who Ellison said was slow but generally honest and not in Walter Greer's pocket, had denied the countermotion and confirmed the February date. Walter Greer himself appeared at Alice's homestead on a Tuesday in early December, which she had not expected, and which gave her a very clear view of the man who had been the source of so much of her recent difficulty. He rode up with 2 of his ranch hands, large men, conspicuously armed, and stopped 20 yards from the house and called her name. Alice came to the door with her rifle, which she had not had occasion to use on a person and did not particularly want to use, but which she had grown very comfortable carrying since Thomas died. Greer was 50-something, heavy across the shoulders, with a reddish-gray beard and the kind of face that had started out ruddy and been cured by weather into something that looked like beef leather. He had expensive clothes and a good horse, and the bearing of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through sheer density of presence. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, looking at the rifle without apparent concern, "I've come to have a conversation." "You can have it from there," she said. He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. "I want you to understand that there's no animosity in this on my part. You're a widow alone on a piece of land, and what I'm offering is a way out that leaves you with something in your pocket and your dignity intact. It's a hard country out here for a woman alone." "It's a hard country for everyone," Alice said. "And I'm not alone. I have a lawyer, and I have a survey, and I have a court date in February, and I have a rancher of standing in this county who will testify to the improvements and the boundaries. So if what you came here for was to suggest that I'm in a weak position, you might want to reconsider your information." Something shifted in Greer's face. She had the sense of a calculation being revised. "Abbott," he said. "It was not a question." "I didn't name anyone," she said. Greer looked at her for a moment and she looked back at him, and neither of them looked away, and then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh and turned his horse. "February, then," he said. "February," she agreed. He rode away with his hands, and Alice stood in the doorway until they were out of sight, and then she went inside and sat down at the table and let her hands shake for a little while, because they had been wanting to the whole time and she had not let them. She wrote to Dexter that evening. She wrote about Greer's visit, and about the survey and the court date, and at the end of the letter she wrote carefully, because she chose her words carefully, that she found she was looking forward to his next visit more than was perhaps entirely practical, and that she thought he should know that. His reply came back 8 days later, and it said, among other practical things about the case and the coming winter and the state of the road between their properties, that he could not think of a more practical thing to look forward to. Christmas came and went quietly. Dexter rode over on the 24th with a small box of supplies, coffee, sugar, a tin of tobacco that he had apparently bought, and then remembered. She did not smoke and brought anyway, because it seemed like a thing one brought at Christmas. And they spent the afternoon together putting the final interior touches on the extension, and hanging the curtains she had sewn from the fabric she had bought on her trip to Millbrook. When the room was done and the curtains were up, and the winter light came through the new window and fell across the plank floor, Alice stood in the middle of it and felt the first real sense of settledness she had felt since Thomas died. Not peace exactly, peace would take longer, but the beginning of something solid. "It's a good room," Dexter said, standing in the doorway between the extension and the original soddy, looking at it. "It is," she said. "Thomas would have been pleased with it." "He would have been pleased with you," Dexter said quietly. She looked at him, and the moment was full of things that neither of them said, but she thought they were both aware of what was in it, and that was sufficient. On Christmas Day, she rode over to the Double Bar A for the first time. It was a proper ranch house, solidly built in 1876, 2 stories, with a wide porch and a bunkhouse out back where old Pete and Ernesto and 2 other hands lived. The interior of the house was functional and clean, and almost entirely without decoration, with good furniture that had clearly been bought with care and then not touched since, and a stone fireplace in the main room that could have heated a considerably larger space. There was food enough for 6 people, and only the 2 of them, which she teased him about, and he said old Pete had done the cooking and old Pete did not know how to do anything in small quantities. Old Pete turned out to be a 60-year-old man with a white beard and a slight limp from an old injury, and the demeanor of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of being simultaneously gruff and warm. He regarded Alice with careful assessment for the first 10 minutes, and then, apparently having reached a conclusion, became immediately and unambiguously welcoming in the way of people who make up their minds quickly and don't revisit the decision. Ernesto was there as well, and 2 other hands named Colton and James, and they ate together at a table that was finally the right size for the room, and there was laughter and easy conversation, and a kind of ease that Alice had not felt in a very long time. She fit into it more naturally than she expected, and she caught Dexter watching her from the other end of the table once with an expression that he did not bother to conceal, and she looked back at him and did not bother to conceal hers either. The new year came in cold and clear, 1883, arriving with the kind of diamond-hard Wyoming winter that made everything look impossibly vivid against the white. Alice worked the homestead and waited for February, and Dexter continued his visits, and the thing between them continued to grow in the unhurried way of something that has both parties' full attention and no urgency, which is the best possible way for something like that to grow. He kissed her for the first time on a Thursday afternoon in late January, 2 weeks before the hearing, when they had been going over Ellison's final set of questions for the testimony and the conversation had simply come to a natural pause, a place where words had been finished and something else took over. It was not unplanned, but it was also not calculated. It happened the way water finds a level, which is to say inevitably and without fuss. She kissed him back with the full and unambiguous conviction of a woman who has decided something and does not take decisions lightly. When they separated, both of them were quiet for a moment, and then Dexter said, "I've been wanting to do that for quite some time." "I know," she said. "How long did you know?" "Since somewhere around the campfire on the Platte," she said, and his eyebrows went up. "And you waited." "I had a case to focus on," she said, and she was smiling, and he laughed, really laughed, and it changed his face entirely in the way she had noticed before, and she thought that she could spend a considerable amount of time looking at him laugh and not get tired of it. The second week of February arrived with a cold snap that put ice on the water barrels and made the horse's breath cloud in the mornings, and Alice rode into the county seat with Dexter beside her, and Robert Ellison meeting them at the courthouse steps. The courthouse looked exactly the same as it had when she had walked out of it in September with shaking hands, and the certainty that she was about to fight the hardest fight of her life. She looked at it now with a different feeling, still tense, still afraid in the way you were always afraid when something that mattered was in someone else's hands, but also steadier than she had been. More herself. Judge Hargreaves was a large man in his 60s, with a substantial gray mustache, and the manner of someone who had been listening to people argue for 30 years, and found most of them less interesting than they thought they were. He called the proceedings to order at 9 in the morning with a gavel strike that rattled the windows, and told both counsel that he expected this to be completed in a day, and that anyone who wasted his time would be finding themselves back here explaining why. Cornelius Fitch represented Walter Greer, who was present in a good suit in the gallery with his red-gray beard trimmed, and an expression of confident patience that Alice looked at once and then did not look at again. Fitch was a slick man in his 40s who moved like he was used to courtrooms and used to winning in them, and he opened his argument with the practiced ease of someone who had made similar arguments before. The claim, Fitch said, had been filed by a man now deceased. The Homestead Act's provisions for widows were narrow and subject to interpretation. The improvements made by the deceased in the 6 weeks of habitation before his death were insufficient to establish the continuous occupation required by law. The survey boundaries were in dispute, a fact confirmed by the filing of a countermotion. He did not mention that the countermotion had been denied, and the property in question bordered land held by his client under a legitimate prior grant. Ellison responded with the kind of quiet, organized devastation that Alice had come to understand was his particular gift. He presented the original deed. He presented the filing receipts and the claim number confirmed by the land office in Cheyenne. He presented Thomas's ledger, which showed entries for every week of habitation before his death. He presented Alice's own record, kept in the same ledger, showing every week of habitation and every improvement made since. He presented Patterson's survey report, certified under federal authority, which established clearly that the Hawthorne claim was within its recorded boundaries and nowhere near the Rocking G holdings. And then he called Dexter Abbott to testify. Dexter sat in the witness chair with the same directness he brought to everything else, no performance, no attempt to appear more or less than what he was, just a man telling the truth in plain language. He had written the Hawthorne claim. He knew the land and the water and the boundary markers. He had observed the homestead and the improvements at multiple points across the previous 5 months. He was familiar with the general topography of the Sweetwater tributary, and could state with confidence that the Hawthorne claim sat well clear of any land Walter Greer held legitimate title to. He said all of this in a steady voice without looking at Greer, and when Fitch cross-examined him and implied that his testimony was motivated by personal interest, Dexter looked at him levelly and said that his interest was in the truth being told accurately, and that he would find no contradiction between the two. Alice herself was called to testify after Dexter, and she answered every question Ellison asked her with the same precision and steadiness she had brought to every step of this process. The improvements, the habitation, the dates, the record in the ledger, her knowledge of the land and the claim and the law as it applied to her situation. Fitch tried on cross-examination to suggest that the improvements were insufficient, that a woman alone could not have maintained the claim in the manner required, and she answered each of his suggestions with a specific date and a specific improvement and a specific entry in the ledger, until he moved on to something else. Judge Hargreaves asked several direct questions of his own, which Alice thought was a sign that he was actually considering the evidence rather than waiting for the afternoon. He asked Ellison to walk him through the survey findings in detail. He asked Patterson, who was present, 2 technical questions about the survey methodology. He asked Fitch to specify precisely which provisions of the Homestead Act he claimed supported his client's challenge, and when Fitch cited one, Hargreaves picked up a volume of territorial statutes from his desk and read the relevant section aloud in full, which, as Alice and Ellison had both expected, said nothing like what Fitch had claimed it said. Fitch made his closing argument at 2 in the afternoon, and it was notably shorter than his opening, and it relied more heavily on the general principle that legal traditions of the territory favored established landholders over new claimants, which was a principle he declined to cite from any specific statute, because no such statute existed. Ellison's closing was 11 minutes long and contained no superfluous words. Judge Hargreaves deliberated for 40 minutes, which Ellison said later was actually fast for him. He came back into the courtroom and settled into his chair and looked over the room with the expression of a man who has made up his mind and is mildly annoyed at having been made to spend time on something that was clearer than it should have been. "The Homestead Act," he said, "provides specifically for the continuation of a deceased homesteader's claim by his widow, provided that the requirements of habitation and improvement are maintained. The documentation presented by counsel for Mrs. Hawthorne demonstrates that those requirements have been met. The survey conducted by the United States government surveyor establishes definitively that the boundaries of the claim are as originally recorded and consistent with the original filing. I find no legal basis for the challenge brought by the plaintiff in this proceeding, and I find the Hawthorne claim to be valid and legally defensible under the applicable provisions of the Homestead Act. The claim stands. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down. Alice sat very still for a moment. The sound of the courtroom moving around her chair scraping, voices beginning, Fitch gathering his papers with the controlled frustration of a man who was going to have an interesting conversation with his client, seemed to come from a slight distance, as though she were hearing it through water. Ellison put his hand on her arm. "You won, Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had known it was possible and was pleased to have the proof. She turned her head and found Dexter immediately, because he was standing at the rail of the gallery looking at her, and his expression was open and unguarded in a way she had not seen it be in a public place. And it was not triumph exactly, more like relief and warmth, and the particular look a person has when someone they care about has come through something hard and come through it whole. She stood up and turned and walked toward the rail, and he came around the end of it to meet her, and she did something she had not planned to do, which was to walk directly into him and put her face against his coat and simply breathe for a moment, and he put his arms around her and held on, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying just then. After a moment she stepped back and looked up at him, and she could feel that her eyes were bright, not with tears but with the particular intensity of someone who has just put down something very heavy. "It held," she said. "It held," he said. "I knew it would." "You didn't know," she said, and she was half smiling. "You hoped." "I believed," he said. "There's a difference." Walter Greer did not say a word to anyone as he left the courthouse, and neither did Cornelius Fitch. They got into a carriage and drove away in the direction of the rocking G, and Alice watched them go from the courthouse steps with the cold February sunlight on her face, and the deed to her land in her hand, and felt the kind of clean, complete satisfaction that only comes after a long and difficult fight that was worth fighting. Ellison shook her hand and Dexter's, collected his final payment, said he hoped he would not see them in his courtroom again, but that if they needed him they knew where to find him, and went back upstairs to his office. Alice and Dexter had dinner that evening at the best restaurant the county seat offered, which was not much by Missouri standards but was warm and decent, and they talked for 3 hours about everything that was not the case, about the ranch and the homestead and the coming spring, about a book she had been reading, and an opinion he had about the territorial railroad expansion, about old Pete's extremely strong views on the proper way to make biscuits, about a foal that had been born at the Double Bar A in January, that was the best-looking animal Dexter had seen in years. Walking back to the boarding house afterward in the cold night air, their breath misting and the stars sharp and enormous overhead the way they only were in wide country, Dexter stopped on the boardwalk and took her hand and held it, and they stood there a moment looking at the stars. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "Not tonight," he said. "Not with the case just finished and everything else. When the spring comes and the dust settles and you've had time to be on your land and know it's yours. Then I want to ask you something." She looked at him. The starlight was sufficient to see his face clearly, and what was on it was everything she needed to see. "All right," she said, "when the spring comes." She went home to her homestead the following morning, and it was hers legally and definitively, and she walked through it slowly and looked at everything as though seeing it for the first time: the stone walls of the original soddy, the new wooden extension with its curtained window, the kitchen garden still covered in frost, the barn, the corral, the slope of land going south toward the creek itself catching the morning light in the way it had the very first day she and Thomas had stood on this rise and looked at it, and Thomas had said, "That's it, Alice, that's where we'll build our life." She had built it. She was still building it, and it was going to stand. Spring came slowly that year, the frost holding through March and the snow not fully gone from the shaded gullies until well into April. But when it came with the full force of the Wyoming spring. The grass coming up so green it was almost violent, the creek running high and silver with snowmelt, the hills going from brown to pale green to a deep lush color that made the sky look bluer by contrast. Alice planted her kitchen garden and dug an expanded vegetable patch in the extension of land past the barn, and she started the repairs and improvements she had been planning through the winter, and she wrote to her sister in Missouri, who had not known any of this was happening, and had to be told all of it in a letter that took 4 pages. Dexter came on a Saturday in mid-April when the cottonwoods along the creek were in their first full leaf, and the morning was warm enough to leave a coat inside. He arrived with a bunch of wildflowers, which he held slightly awkwardly, not because he was awkward generally, but because flowers were not a thing he was accustomed to carrying, and Alice took them from him without comment and put them in the tin pitcher on the kitchen table, because she had not yet acquired a proper vase. They walked the boundary of her claim together, which they had never done as a simple walk without a practical purpose, and the land was beautiful in the spring light and clearly, solidly, unmistakably hers. They walked along the creek and back up through the pasture and around the barn, and came to stand at the top of the southern slope, where the view across the valley was wide and clear, and the Double Bar A was just visible as a smudge of buildings at the far western edge of the landscape. Dexter stopped there and turned to her, and he had that expression again. The open, unguarded one that she had come to understand was his real face, the one under the practical competence and the steady manner. "The spring came," he said. "It did," she said. "I want to ask you something." "I know," she said. He reached into the pocket of his coat and came out with something small, which turned out to be a ring, a plain gold band, not elaborate, which was entirely consistent with everything she knew about him. "I know it's not been a year," he said, "and I know you're still finding your footing in 100 ways, and I know this is not how these things are supposed to go. But I think we both know what this is, and I think you know what I'm asking, and I don't want to wait longer than I need to." "What are you asking?" she said, because she wanted to hear him say it. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said. "I'm asking you to let me be your partner in this life, on your terms, in whatever way works for both of us. The homestead stays yours. Everything is yours that is yours. I'm not asking for anything other than to be where you are." Alice looked at him, this man who had walked into her life in a courthouse corridor and stood beside her through everything that followed without asking for anything, who had offered his name and his testimony and his presence without condition, who had kissed her once in a farmhouse in January and waited patiently for the spring because he understood that she needed the time to be hers before she could give it to anyone else. "Yes," she said. "Dexter, yes." He put the ring on her finger, and it fit almost exactly right, which she would later tease him about. She would ask how he had known, and he would admit that he had asked old Pete, and old Pete had apparently formed a strong opinion about her ring size based on nothing more than a single Christmas dinner, which she thought said a great deal about old Pete. He kissed her on the top of that southern slope with the spring valley spread out below them and the creek bright in the distance, and it was not at all like the first kiss in January, which had been tentative and wondering. This one was certain. It was the kind of kiss that is also a promise, and she kissed him back in exactly the same spirit. They were married in June, in the yard of the Double Bar A, because the house was big enough for a gathering, and the yard was wide enough for a proper party. Robert Ellison came, and Patterson the surveyor came, and old Pete and Ernesto and Colton and James were there, and Alice's friend from the boarding house in Millbrook, who had turned out to be a good-natured woman, named Martha Kane, who had been quietly rooting for her since September, and a number of other people from the valley who had heard about the case and had opinions about it and wanted to come and be part of whatever came after. Alice wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had bought in Millbrook, a pale blue cotton with white at the collar, and she wore her hair down for the first time in what felt like years. And when she came around the corner of the house and saw Dexter standing under the cottonwood with the minister and the whole gathering turned toward her, she saw his expression change in a way that she thought she would probably spend the rest of her life wanting to see. The ceremony was short and direct, the words honest and unadorned, and when it was done and Dexter kissed her for the third time, there was a sound from the gathering that was the kind of genuine, uncomplicated human happiness that is fairly rare in the world and entirely wonderful when it occurs. Old Pete cried and declined to admit it. Ernesto shook Dexter's hand with both of his own and kissed Alice on the cheek, and said something in Spanish that she did not speak well enough to translate, but that sounded like a blessing. Martha Kane hugged her for a long time and said she was very glad this had happened, and Alice said she was too. The celebration went on into the evening, and there was food enough for twice the people present, and someone had brought a fiddle, and the yard of the Double Bar A became the kind of scene that people in a place like Wyoming remembered for years. The kind of evening that seemed to confirm that there was still good in the world even when the world had been working hard to suggest otherwise. In the weeks that followed the wedding, they worked out the practical question of how two people with two properties 12 miles apart arranged a life together, and the answer turned out to be simpler than either of them had worried it might be. Alice kept the homestead because it was legally and emotionally hers, and she was not going to leave it. She stayed there during the week, continuing her improvements and her planting and her management of the land. Dexter came to her on the weekends, or she came to the Double Bar A, and the arrangement allowed both of them to maintain their work without either of them giving up anything. What it required was willingness and organization and genuine respect for each other's independence, all of which they had in abundance. By late summer, it was clear that the arrangement would need to expand, because Alice told Dexter one evening in August, in the kitchen of the homestead with the last light coming through the curtained window, that she was expecting a child. He was quiet for a moment that was slightly longer than a breath, and then he looked at her with something on his face that she would have struggled to describe, but that made her throat tight, and he took her hands across the table and held them. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm very well," she said. "A little tired, otherwise very well." "Then so am I," he said. The practical consequence was that the question of the two properties needed revisiting. Dexter began staying at the homestead more frequently through the autumn, bringing Ernesto over on the days when there was work that needed more than one pair of hands. And between the two of them, they made significant improvements to the house, adding a proper second room, reinforcing the barn, putting in a root cellar that would hold enough through the winter to keep a family fed without having to go to town every month. Old Pete came out once to inspect the root cellar and had a number of extremely specific opinions about its construction, all of which turned out to be correct. Walter Greer, as far as Alice and Dexter could tell, had absorbed his defeat in court and moved on to other projects. He made no further moves against the Hawthorne claim. Whether this was because he had calculated that Ellison and Abbott together made her too costly a target to pursue, or because some small piece of conscience had made itself heard, or simply because he had found other opportunities for expansion, Alice did not know and declined to spend much time wondering. The land was hers. That was what mattered. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was the hardest Alice could remember, and she had lived through some hard Missouri winters. But there was something fundamentally different about being cold in a house that was properly stocked and properly built, with a man who was not afraid of the cold, and who faced every difficulty with the same steady practicality he brought to everything, who got up in the dark mornings without complaint and broke the ice on the water barrels and fed the horses and came back in with snow on his coat and cold cheeks and kissed her and said good morning as though it were all entirely reasonable. She loved him. She had known it for a while, had known it the way you know a thing that has grown so naturally. It is hard to point to the moment it became a fact. But she said it to him one morning in December when he came back in from the cold, and she was making breakfast, and she said it just like that, without build-up or ceremony, simply as the truth it was. He put down the firewood he was carrying and looked at her, and he said it back in the same plain way, and neither of them made a larger thing of it than it was, which was already plenty large. Their son was born in March of 1884, in the homestead house in the room that had been Thomas's study, and was now a proper bedroom, with Martha Kane there as midwife and Dexter pacing the main room with the particular focused distraction of a man trying to be useful in a situation where there is nothing useful he can do. When Martha came out and said it was a boy, Dexter's face did something complicated and quiet that Alice, from the bed, could not see, but Martha described to her later as the expression of a man who has just understood something very large. They named him Samuel Thomas Abbott Samuel because it was Dexter's father's name, Thomas because it was owed, and Abbott because he was Dexter's son and they were a family. He was a robust child with dark hair and very opinionated lungs, and old Pete, when he came to meet him, looked at him for a long time and then said that he had his mother's eyes, which was not yet demonstrably true, but which everyone agreed was a kind thing to say. The homestead in spring of that year was a different place than it had been 2 autumns ago. There were cattle grazing on the southern slope, a small herd that Dexter had moved over from the double bar A, and the kitchen garden was expanded, and the fence line was tight, and the barn was sound, and the house was warm and full of the specific noise that a house makes when there is a baby in it, which is to say, considerably louder than before and entirely better for it. On an afternoon in May, with Samuel sleeping in the cradle that old Pete had built from ash wood, with the focused intensity of a man working on the most important project of his career, Alice and Dexter sat on the front step of the homestead in the late spring sun and looked out across the land. The creek was running bright and the grass was up, and the hills to the south were that deep green that only happened in the spring weeks before the summer dried it back, and the sky was enormous and blue the way that Wyoming sky was, a blue that made you feel both very small and very grateful. This is what he wanted, Alice said, not with sadness, with something that was more like completion. Thomas, when we stood here the first day, this is what he saw. Dexter was quiet for a moment. He put his hand over hers on the step. He had good vision, he said. He did, she said. She turned to look at Dexter, this man who had stood beside her through everything and was still standing, who had not asked for gratitude or recognition or anything other than to be where she was. So do you. I try, he said, and he was smiling, and so was she. Samuel grew through the summer of 1884 into a sturdy, curious child who regarded the world with the same direct attention his mother had and his father's equanimity about whatever he found there. By autumn he was sitting up on his own and attempting, with magnificent determination and limited success, to pull himself upright on any available surface. Old Pete had appointed himself, without consultation, as the primary source of opinions on Samuel's development, and everyone had accepted this as reasonable because Old Pete's opinions were rarely wrong. Ernesto, who had been quietly learning to read and write from a primer that Alice had produced from her trunk in September, because she had noticed him one evening looking at the newspaper with the careful attention of someone who wanted to understand what it said, made substantial progress by winter, and was, by the new year of 1885, managing the double-bar A's supply ledger with a precision that Dexter said was better than anything he had managed himself in years. Alice wrote to her sister in Missouri, a long letter that tried to capture what life was now, the homestead, the case, the marriage, the baby, the sense of something settled and genuinely good that she had not been sure, at various points in the preceding years, she would arrive at. Her sister wrote back with congratulations and questions, and the news that she and her husband were considering their own move west, which set off a lengthy correspondence about the practicalities of such a thing that Alice enjoyed enormously. Dexter, in the quiet of a February evening in 1885, when Samuel was asleep, and the snow was deep, and the house was warm around them, asked her whether she thought about moving to the double bar permanently, now that Samuel was older and the logistics of it were less complicated. She thought about it for a moment, and then said that she thought they should consider building properly on the homestead instead. The Double Bar A was already a functioning ranch with its own rhythms and its own people and its own particular character, and she did not want to crowd any of that. But the homestead land was good, better than he sometimes gave it credit for, and with the cattle and the water and the space, there was potential here for something real. Dexter considered this with the seriousness she knew he gave to things that mattered. Then he said that he thought she was right, and that they should start planning in the spring. They built a proper house that summer, timber-framed and two-storied, on the rise above the original soddy. Dexter's hands came over from the Double Bar A to help, and 2 men from Millbrook who did carpentry, and the house went up over the course of 8 weeks in the long summer days. Alice drew the plans herself, sitting at the kitchen table with paper and a ruler and the practical knowledge of a woman who had been living in and maintaining a building for 3 years and knew exactly what she wanted. 3 bedrooms upstairs, a large kitchen, a proper parlor, a study, a covered porch on the south side that would catch the afternoon sun. Dexter looked at her plans and added 2 things, a wider staircase, because he had hit his shoulder on narrow stairs enough times to have opinions about it, and a room off the kitchen that could be used as a pantry or a 4th bedroom, depending on what was needed. They moved in before the first frost, and the night they did, after Samuel was in his bed in the new room with the window that looked south toward the creek, Dexter built a fire in the new stone fireplace, and they sat in the new parlor in chairs they had brought from the original house and looked at the fire and the new walls and the way the lamplight fell on everything. "It's a real house," Alice said. "It always was," Dexter said. "Just not this big." She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they sat for a long time in the warm quiet of a house they had built together, on land she had fought for and won, in a life that was neither what she had planned nor what she had feared, but something better than either, something earned, something real, something that belonged entirely to them. In the spring of 1886, Samuel was 2 years old and conducting his investigations of the world from a standing and then running position, a development that required considerably more attention from everyone around him. He had his father's steadiness and his mother's willful directness, which old Pete said was going to make him either very successful or an enormous difficulty to raise, and possibly both. He had discovered the horses with the passion of someone who has found the thing they were built for, and Dexter had begun, with great patience and care, to introduce him to the animals in the way that you introduced a child to something powerful slowly, with respect, letting the understanding build at its own pace. Alice told Dexter in April that Samuel was going to be a brother, and this time Dexter did not need a moment at all. He simply smiled, the real smile that changed his face entirely, and pulled her in and held her, and she could feel in the strength of it that he was as glad as a person could be. The second child, a girl, arrived in October of 1886, squalling and imperious from her first breath, and they named her Clara Me Abbott. She had her mother's auburn hair from the beginning, which delighted everyone, and she had a particular way of looking at people that made it clear, from approximately the first week of her life, that she intended to form strong opinions and share them. Samuel regarded her with the grave seriousness of a 3-year-old encountering something entirely new to him, and old Pete said that it was going to be extremely interesting to watch the two of them grow up, and Alice said she hoped he was planning to be around for it, and old Pete said he expected he was, which turned out to be true. The Double Bar A continued to operate under Dexter's management, with Ernesto having grown into a role that was considerably more than a ranch hand's. He managed most of the day-to-day operations with a capability that Dexter acknowledged openly and compensated accordingly, and the two of them had developed the easy, honest working relationship of people who respect each other's particular skills and have no interest in pretending otherwise. On a spring afternoon in 1887, when the valley was in full bloom and Samuel was racing around the yard after a dog they had acquired from a family in Millbrook, and Clara was sitting in the sun on the porch looking at the world with her considering gaze, Walter Greer sold the Rocking G Ranch and left Harlan County. The news came through Millbrook in the way all news came through Millbrook, in a letter to the general store that got read by the postmaster, and then distributed to the rest of the county within approximately 4 days. He had sold to a cattle company out of Denver at a price that suggested the 11,000 acres had not yielded the return he had hoped for, and he was reportedly going east. Alice heard the news without particular emotion either way, which was exactly the right way to hear it. It was simply information. The land remained. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Alice sat on the south porch in the last of the spring light and looked out across the valley. The creek was silver in the low sun, and the pasture was green, and the cattle were dark shapes moving slowly across the southern slope. Dexter came out and sat beside her bringing 2 cups of coffee, and they sat together in the evening that was soft and warm and full of the sounds of the land, the creek, a nighthawk somewhere, the cattle, the wind in the cottonwoods. "Do you ever think about Missouri?" Dexter asked. "Sometimes," she said. "I think about my sister. I think about certain things I left behind." She paused. "I don't miss it. I miss the people I knew there, some of them. But this is where I belong." She looked at him. "Where did you belong before this?" He thought about it. "I thought I knew," he said. "I had the Double Bar A and the land and the work, and I thought that was what belonging felt like. And it was something like it." He was quiet for a moment. "But this is different. This is more." She put her hand on his and they sat together in the growing dark, and the stars came out one by one over the Wyoming hills, the same stars that had been there when she had stood in that courthouse corridor with a deed and no plan, and nothing but the certainty that the land was hers, and she was going to fight for it. The same stars that had been over the Platte River campfire when this strange and wonderful thing had begun to take shape. When a man with papers under his arm had caught her before she stumbled and had not, in all the ways that mattered, let go since. Samuel's voice came from inside, the brief cry of a child disturbed by a dream and then settling back, and they both turned their heads to listen, and then turned back when the sound did not continue. Clara's sleep was always silent and complete, as though she had decided that sleeping was a thing she was going to do correctly. "I'm glad you walked around that corner in the courthouse," Alice said. "I had been in there for an hour before you arrived," Dexter said. "I had finished my business and I kept finding reasons to stay. I still don't entirely know why." "I know why," she said. "Do you?" "Because some things are necessary," she said. "Before they've happened, they're still necessary. You just don't know it yet." He looked at her with those clear brown eyes in the starlight, and what was in his face was everything that had been there from nearly the beginning: the attention, the steadiness, the warmth that he kept mostly for the people he trusted, and the trust itself, which he had given her, and which she had given him, and which had proved, in every test they had put it through, to be solid and genuine and more than enough. "Yes," he said. "I think that's exactly right." They stayed on the porch until the stars were thick overhead and the valley was dark and the night was warm enough to make it worth staying. And then they went inside to their house, their children, their life on the land that the law had tried to take and had not, because she had not let it, because she had walked into a courthouse with her back straight and her documentation in order, and the ferocious, unshakable conviction that what was hers was hers. And because a man had come around a corner at exactly the right moment and offered his name and his testimony and his presence, and eventually everything else. The land was theirs. The children were in their beds. The stars were doing what they had always done, indifferent and magnificent. And Alice Hawthorne, Alice Abbott now, though she still thought of the homestead as Hawthorne land, because Thomas had earned that and would always have earned it. Alice sat in her house that she had built in her life that she had fought for, and she was grateful, and she was content, and she was entirely, definitively home. The years that followed settled into the deep, sustaining rhythm of a life well lived on land that repaid work with abundance. Samuel grew into a boy who could sit a horse by the age of 5, with a seat that made Dexter's chest tight with pride, and who asked questions about everything he encountered with the relentless curiosity of a mind that was always working. Clara, by contrast, took longer to find her particular passion, and then found it decisively at the age of 4 when Alice read to her from a book and she understood, suddenly and completely, what reading was and what it was for, and she became, from that moment forward, a child who wanted books the way other children wanted candy, and who could be found at any hour of the day with something open on her lap. Reading with the total absorption of someone for whom stories were not entertainment but oxygen. Old Pete's prediction that they would be interesting to watch grow up turned out to be an understatement of considerable proportions. They were also deeply kind to each other, in the way of siblings who have been raised in a house where kindness is modeled rather than merely instructed, and who understand, without having been told explicitly, that the people in your household are the people you stand beside. Ernesto found his own happiness in the form of a woman named Rosa who came to Harlan County from New Mexico with her brother and his family in 1888. And Alice organized the wedding celebration at the homestead because the space was right, and because she genuinely liked Rosa, who had a directness and a warmth that reminded her, in the most comfortable way, of herself. Dexter stood as Ernesto's witness, and old Pete cried at this wedding too, and admitted it this time. The homestead and the Double Bar A found a working relationship that was, by the late 1880s, simply called the Abbott operation by everyone in the valley, though both properties retained their legal independence. They ran cattle on both pieces of land, the Sweetwater water rights giving them an advantage in dry summers that their neighbors envied, and Dexter's reputation and Alice's record had made them, together, one of the more respected operations in Harlan County. Alice had never stopped fighting for things she believed were right. She helped 2 other homestead families in the valley with their legal situations, not as a lawyer, but as someone who knew the system and knew the people who moved through it, who could tell a frightened family which lawyer to see and what documents to gather, and what the process actually looked like on the ground. She wrote letters to the territorial legislature about the homestead provisions for widows, which remained inadequate in her judgment, and she signed her name to them fully and sent them without apology. Some of them were acknowledged, some were not. She kept writing. On an evening in the autumn of 1889, the year Wyoming became a state, Alice and Dexter walked the boundary of the homestead claim as they had walked it the day he had asked her to marry him, following the creek and the fence line, and the markers that were now well settled and weathered from years of sitting in the same place. Samuel was 9 and Clara was 3, and they had been left at the house with old Pete, who was teaching Samuel to play cards with the cheerful tolerance of someone who expected to lose. The evening was warm and golden, the way Wyoming evenings were in the fall, with the light going low and the hills going amber and the creek moving quiet and clear over its stones. They walked without hurry, because they had nowhere to be, and they talked about everything and nothing about Clara's reading and Samuel's horses, and Ernesto's new management plans for the spring, and what statehood might mean for the territory's land laws, and whether they should get another dog since the first one had gotten old and slow and needed retirement from his yard duties. At the top of the southern slope, where the view was widest and the evening light was fullest, they stopped and stood together and looked out across everything that was theirs: the house, the barn, the cattle, the creek, the pasture going green and gold, the hills beyond, the sky enormous and turning purple at the edges. Thomas Hawthorne staked this claim in 1882, Alice said. He had 6 weeks on it before he died. And his wife kept it, Dexter said. His wife kept it, she said. And then quietly, our family built it. Dexter took her hand, and she leaned against him, and they stood there together on the top of the rise while the evening came in around them, and the lights of the house below were warm in the gathering dark, and somewhere inside old Pete said something that made Samuel laugh, and the sound of it carried up the slope in the still air clear as a bell. It was a life, fully and completely a life built on loss and courage and an unlikely courthouse corridor, and the willingness of 2 honest people to stand beside each other through everything the world offered, which had turned out to be quite a lot, and to come out on the other side of it together, holding on. The claim had held. Everything else had followed from that.